all on her own, sustained and maintained and created the Journal for Educational Controversy. And we are here tonight to celebrate the last journal with several of the authors who we have the privilege of hearing from tonight. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I'm really looking forward to this great critical dialogue. You'll have an opportunity to meet our authors and engage. So have an extraordinary evening and welcome, and please make this your first stop and seat if you haven't been here before, and keep coming back.
Thank you. Well, welcome to all of you. This is our 14th annual Educational Law and Social Justice Forum, and also the 5th anniversary of the Journal for Education Controversy. And one of the things we've been doing for the last 5 years is using these forums as a way of introducing our authors to our readers and to our students and our faculty, so that you can engage them in a conversation about the articles you're reading. If you haven't read any of the articles yet, I invite all of you personally to please take a look at it. It's online. The current issue that we're going to be talking about tonight is called "The Education and Schools That Our Children Deserve." And you might kind of recognize that title a little bit. It was named after a book by Alfie Kohn called "The Schools Our Children Deserve." And Alfie wrote the prologue to this issue, and we actually dedicated the issue to him. So one of the things we wanted to do with this issue was to look at some of the deeper issues in education. You know, if you look at the way education is treated in the national dialogue, people talk about it as if it was a commodity. People talk about it as if, you know, education, the whole purpose of education is to make us globally competitive in the world. The whole issue, you know, the whole purpose is standards and accountability. And no one asks, well, accountable for what? I mean, what's the whole purpose of what we're doing? And so what we wanted to do in this issue was to give authors a chance to talk about some of those deeper purposes. What are the public purposes of education? How does education lead to a meaningful life? And something we don't even talk about in the national dialogue. Have you ever seen President Obama come out and say, we need education so everybody can lead a meaningful life? No, it's always, you know, we got to be competitive. We got to beat those other nations in our economy. So those are the kinds of issues that we wanted to try to get our authors to address. Now, the most important part of all of this is really you. I want you to think about what is important to you at this moment in your career. How are you thinking about this issue? You know, I always used to tell my students, the most important question you should ask yourself is, what am I becoming as a result of my education? What am I allowing myself to be influenced by? And why? And how am I evolving in my thinking? How am I defining myself, both as a person and as a teacher? And those are the questions I want you to keep asking yourself. And for that reason, in your program, you're going to find a think sheet. And the think sheet asks you to, right now, at this very moment, what are the 3 characteristics that are important to you that you believe our schools, characterize the schools our children deserve? I'm going to ask you to write that down right now. Just jot down very briefly. What's important to you? What are the schools look like that our children deserve? And then at the very end of our forum this evening, I'm going to ask you in the last 5 minutes to just write down your ideas might have changed having interacted with the panelists. Did you add anything that you hadn't even thought about before? Have you revised any of your thinking? Have you refined your thinking? You see things a little bit deeper now as a result. And what we're planning to do is we're going to take those link sheets, and James, who's sitting right here, is actually going to collect them at the end. And then he's going to write a post on our blog. The journal has its own blog. And we're going to write a post on the blog showing what you thought when you first came here, and then how your thinking might have changed as a result of the forum. So we want to be able to give you a voice now on the blog so that you can see how your generation of teachers is starting to think about these deeper issues. Please come.
Okay, let me just get my life together here. It might be about a year.
Feel free to come anytime.
Okay, thank you.
So let me first introduce our panel. And I thought what I would do is introduce each of you, and then I'm going to sit down and you can just take it in the order that I introduced you. There's a kind of a sequence to all of this. The first speaker is going to be Dr. Paul Shaker. Dr. Shaker is a professor emeritus at Simon Fraser University in Canada. And he's also the former dean of the School of Education at Simon Fraser. Paul contributed 2 things to this journal, this particular issue of the journal. He wrote an article, first of all, called The Politics of Arrested Development, Deepening the Purposes of Education. And his second contribution was, we did a review of his book. He wrote a book called Reclaiming Education for Democracy, Thinking Beyond No Child Left Behind. And we decided rather than having a printed review, we would try an experiment. So we videotaped 3 people discussing his book. And we had one of those persons, Val Hartley, who you'll see on the tape, discussing Paul's book. And then Paul actually wrote a printed response to it, so we had 3 contributions from Paul. So Paul is going to start us off by looking at that broader critique of American education. What are the forces against public education today? What's the big picture that we need to look at? And then we're going to move to Val Hartley, because I know a lot of your students here, and I know what questions students ask. Give me something that works. I want to look at it. I want to see what it looks like. So we're going to take you inside a school that actually is a very progressive school that tries to develop all aspects of a child's development. It tries to align itself with democratic principles. And the author of the article was called Creating a School Meant for Children, a multimedia presentation. Susan Donnelly was the head of the school, but she was also the co-editor of this issue. And Susan included a lot of video to show you what it looks like. What does it look like in a classroom where kids are having a community meeting? So we have about 27 video clips in that article. Susan couldn't make it tonight, but we're fortunate to have a teacher, Val Hartley, come. And you'll notice when you read the article, you'll see Val in all the videos. She has brought some marvelous ideas to the school. She might talk about her Nurture Heart approach that she introduced in her school. And we do have an article by Val in an earlier issue that I might mention to you. It was called The Elementary Classroom, a Key Dimension of a Child's Democratic World. And in that article, Val talks about using Socratic questioning with young kids. and gives you examples of it. Okay, so now we got a picture of what's wrong with education, what a good school really looks like. What about teachers? If you want to teach in a school that children deserve, what should you be like? What qualities should you have? What dispositions should you have? And our next authors address that very issue, called The Teachers Our Children Deserve. David Carroll is in the elementary education department here at Western, and his co-editor is Annie Parker, who graduated from here last July, and she teaches in the 3rd grade in Seattle. We're so grateful that she's actually up in Seattle to be with us tonight. Thank you, Annie. This was a really interesting article, because what the two of them do is Annie draws little scenarios, little stories, little experiences, and she describes her own experiences in the classroom, in these little vignettes. And then David looks at what Annie is doing and says, now look at all these great qualities that Annie is exhibiting in her teaching. So it's a very unique article, and I just wanted to share that with us. Okay, so now we know what dispositions teachers should have, what qualities they should have. What about a school of education? What should be you're all in a school of education. What should a school of education be? Well, we're so fortunate to have our new dean, Francisco Rios, with us tonight. And Dean Rios wrote an article called The Future of Colleges of Education. And again, in the same spirit as all of our panelists, Dean Rios looks at schools of education as anchored in a broader set of purposes, broader missions. Now, what is it all about? That's the question I want you to keep asking yourself. So I'm going to stop at this point and hand it over to our panelists, and we'll start with Paul Schaefer.
Thanks, Lorraine. I'm going to come out here so I can see what you're putting up there. You want to go into a... Okay. Should we dim any lights, or can you see that okay? No, I think you wanted 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, 10 or 15.
Yeah, okay. I had to put this up because it's so timely, and I will connect it to what I have to say here on May. Today's Wednesday, the 2nd, right? So that all just happened yesterday. Let's go to the next slide. That poster, comes from Vancouver, BC, from Adbusters magazine, which I'm going to mention again in a moment. But that movement has its roots, or at least it was branded there. So my remarks take off from an article that's in the current issue of the journal, but I deviated from the article in light of the topic that we're dealing with today. So the first 2 sections of this talk are in the article, but the last 2 sections aren't. I go in a little different direction. The article stays with a more focused theme about psychological development. All these paintings are from a Welsh artist named John Bourne, and they're a representative of a movement called Stuckism in the UK, and that has to do again with the theme I'm going to pick up later in the talk. So I start off in the article by talking about depth psychology and lifespan developmental psychology using the ideas of Carl Jung and Erik Erikson. And one of Jung's ideas is the ego should be looked upon as a sense organ because it develops just as naturally. I saw a little boy here just a minute ago. I have a 2.5-year-old grandson. It develops just as naturally as all the other attributes of a child. And we don't talk about it that much. We don't study enough about it. The psychology that we get in teacher preparation has been only too influenced by a narrow version of psychology, and not much, not enough by developmental psychology and lifespan developmental psychology. Hopefully you're getting some of that. Some programs do get into it some, but it's not an easy study. But the ego develops through a process of differentiation and integration, according to theorists like Jung. That is, as a child develops, they begin to separate themselves from the world. They learn their identity. They associate with certain things like their gender identity, their family, their race, their religion, and at the same time they differentiate themselves from all the other things that are not what they perceive as a part of them. That's natural and appropriate, and it's inevitable. That's how we get started in life, to have a sense of who we are, even our name, and the beginnings of our language, and that we speak one language and not another. All of that's fine as far as it goes. But a problem comes along in that as we grow up, we don't have good models from separating the ego from our larger self. And there's a tendency, and again, I can't do this justice in 10 minutes, but in the paper I try to treat it more broadly. We identify the ego with the self. In other words, we don't think we're anything but our ego. We don't think we're anything but those contents that separate us out, our gender, our race, our religion. We don't come back to putting ourselves into a larger whole. That's not typical in our society. Most people go all through life thinking they are their ego, and there's no more to them than that. So it's very important to them how they're separated from other people by their nationality, by their loyalties, by their values. So that's a quick review of how the paper starts, and there's a couple of books that this is based on. Now, I think it'll become a little more clear when I go into this next section, what I'm talking about. So what the paper talks about, since the journal is about controversy, is how the ego gets built around some things that are what Dewey would call miseducated, not constructive. Like these two negative emotions, which are very prevalent in American society in the last decade. You know, 9/11 stirred up all sorts of feelings of fear, and to a large extent, the public marketplace of ideas was dominated by fear of another terrorist attack. You heard so much of that, and we have a war on terrorism, whereas more moderate voices said it should have always been treated as criminal activity, not as a war, because it's a war that can never end, because it's an enemy that can never be clearly identified. But anyway, you had plenty of fear stirred up in American society after 9/11. And then the great example of anger was the Tea Party movement in 2010. That was a fascinating demonstration of the power of media and money to create a movement, and $40 million, I've read, was put into it by the Koch brothers in order to dictate political outcomes. It was masterful, worked beautifully, and it was based to a large extent on stirring up anger in people. People were so angry about TARP and government bailouts and so on and so forth that, in a sense, they cut off their nose to spite their face. And as you see, we've had all sorts of repercussions afterwards in Wisconsin, in my own state of Ohio, where the public's been rolling back some of the things that they created by the people that they elected in this spirit of anger, because anger is not a very good way to make political decisions. So anyway, there's a couple of ways that the ego can be formulated. There are also symbols of exclusion, like these famous ones, which we avoid discussing at family gatherings. The most prominent one, I think, right now is homosexuality, the way that's dividing so many elements of our society, the way that it's driven some of our mainline churches, for example, that even people who want to be inclusive, I think Rick Warren's a great example of this, somebody who I think is trying to be socially constructive, but can't get around the issue of homosexuality and wrap his arms around all human beings. So again, the ego identification of many people is with heterosexuality, and because they're identified with that, they feel obligated to disdain people of other persuasions. This is that egoistic, exclusionary sort of thinking. In polite company, we don't demonstrate our racism anymore. We've gotten that far, but discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation is still alive and well. And then there are icons of exclusion, like the Confederate flag, the Ku Klux Klan's burning cross, and whatever guns mean in our society. It's hard to say, but they sure mean something big. And it's obviously not to just shoot them at things that need to be shot at. They have some much greater symbolic value. So these are symbols and icons along with emotions that people get identified with and construct their ego, and then if they think their ego is the sum total of who they are, they construct, in effect, their self. And here are some references having to do with this. As I told you, Adbusters magazine is the source of the Occupy poster. Thomas Frank is the fellow who wrote What's the Matter with Kansas. He writes for Harper's Magazine. He does a very nice job. He's a historian. And then Wilkerson and Pickett are from the UK, and they've written a book called The Spirit Level, which has gotten a great deal of attention in the last couple of years because it talks about how inequality is associated with unhappiness in societies, and equality is associated with happiness in societies. Now, to come to what Lorraine wants us to talk about, educational values that would enter into this picture to override the picture that I've been drawing. This term, eusociality, is being propagated now by E.O. Wilson, one of our greatest scientists, the creator of the concept, or the propagator of the concept of sociobiology. Eusociality, in his new book, which I'll give you the title of in a minute, is a higher order way of looking at natural selection and evolution. You know, the classic way to look at evolution is survival of the fittest, and it was thought to be by individuals. The most fit individual would be the one that reproduced or survived, and their genetic makeup would prevail. President Obama just mentioned social Darwinism. In the last couple of weeks, remember, he was accusing Wall Street of social Darwinist policies. Caused a stir because ever since Darwinism was created right on its heels, Herbert Spencer propagated the notion that it should be extrapolated onto human society, and there was a social Darwinism that we should look at. We should favor and acknowledge that certain peoples or races or nationalities or individuals were superior, and we shouldn't get in the way of them dominating. So what Wilson is doing is saying that this thinking had evolved into group selection. First it had evolved into kinship selection in the 60s. People thought, no, it's not right to just look at individuals as being the carriers of natural selection. We should look at kinship groups, families, and people will exercise altruism, will give up their own self-interest in favor of those that they share genes with. But now Wilson's thought has gone to a larger term called group selection. And the point he's making, which is similar to the point that's being made in the spirit level, is societies or groups, in fact the human race, if it identified itself with its interests as a race, instead of as individuals or tribes, would generate the most productivity and benefit for all. And the simple way to look at this is compassion. The reference I use on compassion is Karen Armstrong's, whose new book, she's a historian of theology, whose new book really focuses on compassion. Compassion for all other people is a way to honor this term of group selection, of eusociality, of identifying with all human beings. And another term for it, one that reflects the work of Bishop Desmond Tutu, is inclusivity, that we include all people in our notion of who we want to see benefit. And if we were to draw that circle around the whole human race, then we could all benefit. All the wasted time, energy, and suffering that goes into war and deprivation could be eliminated if we saw ourselves as identified with all of our brothers and sisters around the planet instead of just this group or that group. And there's the references. And to conclude, okay, so there is in the air a new way of looking at things. And I can give you a number of examples. One of them is Occupy. Another is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Desmond Tutu created in South Africa. Another is the work of a Danish architect named Bjarke Ingels. This notion of metamodernism, it goes by different names. Post-postmodernism is one of the terms that's used for it. I first ran across it at the American Association of Historians, the American Historical Association meeting, because it turns out that historians are looking for unifying concepts through which to understand the big picture of where our society is headed. The 2008 Obama campaign, not what's happened since, but the campaign was a moment of this. Alison Redford's new government in Alberta, I don't imagine you follow Canadian politics, but the progressive conservatives there have turned a corner and are operating in a different manner than they have previously. The television program Awake, if you watch that on Thursday nights. So, metamodernism, this is a worldview beyond modernism, beyond postmodernism. Go ahead. Declares subjective personal values authentically and sincerely, without irony, and not limited to the material and logical, but with acceptance of intuition and feeling. So if we were as developed, and this is part of the paper that I didn't talk about. I talk about what intuition and feeling look like if they're developed fully in a Jungian sense. If we had the intuition to understand that our wasted resources could be applied to helping one another and would provide for the necessities of life for everyone. If we had the developed feeling to really be empathic and compassionate toward other people, we would be motivated to do this. If we weren't trapped in a world, as Lorraine said, that is just economically driven with a narrow point of view and caught up in these egoistic divisions among ourselves, then we could create a sustainable and utopian society. And we see intimations of it in social democracies around the world, including even elements of it in Canada that we don't have in the United States. In conclusion, the Social Democratic Party in Canada runs on a platform of equality, not equal opportunity, which would be more what Americans are used to hearing. Not social justice, although the term they use is inclusive of it, it's social democracy. And what they mean by equality, when Adrian Dix, who's running for Premier of British Columbia now, when he speaks for equality, he doesn't mean that you take all of Mitt Romney's money away, or 99% of it, so that we all have, whatever, $100,000 a year, and so does he. What they mean by equality is that we're all equal in terms of the necessities of life. That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we all have a minimum opportunity toward. That is, the great example that we lack in America is medical care. That medical care would be as available and as free of cost as the public school is. Now, to Americans, that seems impossible or remote, but you understand it is that way in Canada and in nearly all the developed countries of the world, that being sick and going to the doctor doesn't involve insurance, and that it's taken care of just like the public school is taken care of for your children. So that's an example of something that generally Americans are blocked on seeing because they've been convinced by media and the world they live in that that's impossible. But countries like Canada do it, and they do it. Canada does it for 2/3 the cost that America expends in its GDP on healthcare. So what I'm talking about is not visionary and impossible. It requires inclusivity, however, and compassion in its address to one another. So I'll stop at that point then. Okay. You can put up the next one.
So Lorraine, I have a question in terms of format. I understood that you wanted to have questions and answers. Do you want to do that all at the end or after each person's done speaking?
Maybe we should just go through all of the
Okay.
ideas, put them all on the floor, and then we can assimilate it and ask questions.
Because as I know as a teacher that some students in my class would find that very off-putting. So maybe you can get out there at the beginning. If you know your audience and you know what's going on, then the kids will not be able to hold on to that. And they would need to write it down or have some support for how to continue to engage with them. I'm Dale Hartley, and I am a classroom teacher at Walking Bay Academy, which is an independent school here in Bellingham, just north of town on the northwest, right near the soccer fields. If you've ever been out that way, you've been by our school. Just finished my 9th year teaching there. I came to teaching a little bit late in life after a career doing other things, and I'm glad to be here. So those of you that happen to be older than maybe your cohorts, don't give up. It's awesome. As Lorraine mentioned, our school is featured in this journal issue as a school that children deserve. And a good part of that right now, I think, needs to be credited to Susan Donnelly, who is our head of school, and who put a lot of effort into the article that's in the journal, and her vision and Lorraine's vision that we could put video in it. So people like you don't have to wonder what does it look like to do what we're talking about. And you don't have to scrounge and hunt in the bushes for a school that does it and then beg permission to get in the door. You can go online and watch. So we welcome you to open up and look at the videos that we have. I'd like to say that following Paul's presentation was timely because he talked about compassion and he talked about intuition and feeling. And all of those are things that I would argue are important as teachers and as a school to develop in its climate. And I think David and Annie will talk about the teaching part, but I want to try to talk, Susan was going to talk more about the school climate, and since she isn't here, I'm trying to fill in her role and then also do a little bit of my classroom practice. I think because I understand that schools of education are accountable for teaching candidates about public education and its requirements for testing and standards and so forth, I understand that most of you are looking at a lens of education through that model. And I have to say I feel really fortunate in some ways that I'm in an independent school and have an option to look at teaching through a different lens. We still do some kinds of testing, and we are accountable to our parents and to society when we move our children on in life, but we don't have some of the same expectations that we have. And that gives us some freedom, I think, to kind of look at how we teach in a different way. I had on your seats and when you came in a copy of Whatcom Bay Academy's mission and belief statements, and I handed those out today because they are, thank you David, these are kind of the foundational underpinnings of how we teach. And we just went through an accreditation process, and the people that came to visit and look at us said, we got it. This is really how you teach. This is what your kids are doing. This is what your teachers are doing. This is how your curriculum is built. This is really what we come to school every day to do. And evidence shows that this is what we do. And while there are many of them, I want to focus on the first one that's on your list of educational beliefs. Because at some level, this is the underpinning for everything that we do. Backing up briefly, I want to say that it is our mission to teach what, archaically has been called the whole child. We really believe that children inhabit their whole bodies. Some of them are really into jumping, and that's the most important thing in the world to them. And others are into music, and children come to school with many parts of who they are. And so we're not just about the math, reading, and writing portions of who they bring to school. And in fact, one of Susan's great contributions to our school was a really deep understanding of what kids are really interested in when they look at the world is basically two things. When they're really young, they're very interested, one, in their social relationships with, as they developmentally grow, with their mothers, their siblings, their worlds around them. So they're very interested in what we call the social sciences as they move through life, and that becomes more complex. And the other thing they're really curious about is their natural worlds, what we call natural science. So our curriculum is built around two strands of social science and natural science, which I'm in a writing collective right now with public school teachers who say, all we do is work on reading and writing. We haven't taught social studies all year. And it breaks my heart because that's what kids are interested in. They don't really care about reading and writing and math. They care about their friends. They care about what's going on outside. So we use those things as a way to teach reading and writing and math to a large extent because that's what kids are interested in. So why not start there? And that was one of Susan's great contributions, was to reorganize how we think about what we do through that lens. But then, once we're kind of there, we've got the mission and beliefs. The piece that I really want to talk about and what Susan wanted to share tonight as her biggest kind of epiphany of working in our school for the last 12 years is the critical importance of creating a safe emotional environment for children. And when I thought about what to say about that tonight, I kind of think about it as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And for children, rather than shelter, the real ticket in the door is emotional safety. And if children don't have that, they're not available to learn. And our school has been on kind of an improvement process over the last 10 years to really work on, we didn't understand at the beginning that we were really so conscious of it. We weren't. I mean, we all came to school. I mean, who comes to school to be mean to children? I mean, nobody does. We all come to school to be nice to children. And in my own student teaching experience, my supervisor said, remember, Vale, that on your worst day, you might be some child's best hope. And I carry that with me every day. I mean, I may have what feels like a really crappy day. I was impatient, I was rude, I didn't do whatever I meant to do, but I don't know what my kids took away. And on even my best, worst days, I hope that some child took something away from me, that they're willing. Annie's nodding her head, she gets it. So that's really, and over time we've become even more conscious of how important it is to do that. Lorraine has made reference to the nurtured heart approach, which is something that we use in our school as our, if you will, social emotional model, our discipline system. And I can answer more questions about that later. I'm a certified trainer of Nurtured Heart, and I offer parenting classes at our school, and classes that anybody in the community is welcome to attend, including teachers from everywhere. So this emotional safety piece includes a number of components, one of which is it's a social emotional curriculum that includes at the younger levels teaching kids how to read each other's feelings, how to express themselves about their own feelings and needs. And by the intermediate level where I teach 3rd through 5th grade, it includes an anti-bullying curriculum called Steps to Respect. So it's a second step, and Steps to Respect curriculum, that's one piece. The Nurtured Heart piece that I've talked about is another. Another is what Susan calls a culture of collaboration that we teach the children, so they work together in groups, and that kind of cultivates what you were talking about, this idea of inclusivity and understanding each other's perspectives and so forth. And then she has reference in here to conducting class meetings, but I like to think about that in a more global sense. Our school belongs to something called the League of Democratic Schools, which you can check out online. Democratic with a small d, and it's based in Seattle out of this kind of adjunct organization to the University of Washington, and it's about helping schools identify ways to foster democratic practice and help students understand what it means to be a citizen in a larger context, not just kind of, as you're saying, beyond themselves, their families, but in a classroom where other people's needs are important also. And there's a lot of emphasis on that kind of concept of civil discourse and listening to each other, and even with our 3-year-olds with perspective taking and so forth. And so there are various kinds of videos on the article about that. But I've chosen a video clip today of my class engaged in a class meeting. I get a lot of questions about what do class meetings look like at this age, how does it work, how do class meetings work to 6-year-olds, what do they look like to 14-year-olds, what do you do, what does it look like? So I am gifting to you 7 or 8 minutes of my class in a class meeting discussing the topic of eating outside at lunch. And I'll just leave it at that for a few minutes.
Amicably,
So if you can't see
but yet not
something,
agree about something that's a problem. It's just a great way to learn to grow up.
Every classroom in the school is using class meetings now, sometimes to develop jobs, sometimes to develop social contracts, and always to solve the problems that students bring. And when we're done with this, we've done our class jobs, we've done our social contract. Right now we have a class meeting agenda that the children are already adding more problems of their own to be solved over here. Okay, so this is our class meeting agenda, which the students own. So they have written some ideas that they think we need solutions to, including playing games at lunch, what the rules are about climbing in the trees on the playground, whether or not we're ready for hot drinks in our class, something about binders I don't understand, something about stacking chairs. One little boy wants to have show and tell, which we do in the younger grades, and we usually don't do it this grade, but who knows. And somebody wants to rename our class, a new name for the intermediate class. class. She wants a different name. So these are all topics we'll bring up at future class meetings. Okay, we have a joint class meeting today. The first two items have to do with eating outside at lunch. And one of them you guys brought up, and one of them I brought up on behalf of Mrs. Phelan, or Ms. Phelan, and I think also Maestra might feel that way too. So here's a couple issues. You now have the privilege of eating outside at lunch once a week. That's a privilege you've negotiated for. Everybody's pretty happy with eating outside once a week, but now that the weather's improved, I think some other people have brought up, so the people representing this problem are Liam, Avery, Nachito, and Jimmy. Would one of those people be willing to tell me more about the problem that you have? Okay, Liam, I'm going to call on you.
I don't want to eat outside once because some, like, say like on Monday, it's really nice and we eat outside, but then there are like a lot of other nice days and we won't eat outside again because it's been really nice for like a whole week.
Okay. Does anybody else in that committee of people that brought that problem up have anything else to add? Jimmy?
I know you don't eat outside. Maybe not like 50 times a week or like 7 times a week. Maybe like twice. Like last year we had, I think, twice a week.
Okay, so you're recognizing that 5 might be too many and maybe 2 would be a place in the middle. Yeah. And I'd like to really appreciate the fact that, okay, so Jimmy is saying more than once, maybe 2 could be enough. Jimmy, what is the total number of possibilities? 5. So even though you said 5, Jimmy knows that, or 50, that we're not going to do it 50 times. Okay, so we're now here maybe moving to 2. Okay, does anybody else have anything to add? Colin?
Well, in order to really do this, then we need to get Miss Phelan's opinion.
So we need the adult supervisors.
The opinions on like how comfortable they feel doing eating outside and feel willing to do it, like
Colin, I love you. I love it. Did everybody hear? Colin said, 1, we need someone else's opinion, the people involved, and 2, he recognized that they have opinions and feelings about that, so he said, we really need to know how comfortable they would be with doing that. So, yeah. Okay, Connor.
I do agree with Liam that since the days are getting really nice now and it's really hot out, like today, that we can have like maybe 2 times a week.
Okay. Thank you. Your vote is registered. Heidi.
I know that I've never liked eating outside, and that it kind of bugs me, and I know that I won't do it, but I'm okay with people eating outside. I don't really mind.
As long as there's still a provision
Yeah.
for you to eat inside.
Yeah.
All right, so, see, Heidi is one of the key dissenters, and she's saying it doesn't work for her, but she stands behind the idea that it works for the rest of you, and she's willing to support that. So good for her. That's generosity on her part. Thank you. Okay, Avery.
I know I also think that we need adult supervision, and I know that we also have to check with you and the other people who will be watching people inside, because there might be more people that want to eat inside.
So you're suggesting that if you were allowed to eat out more often, some people might feel like Tegla and not want to eat out that often, and so we might end up with more people wanting to stay indoors, and then there's an indoor supervision.
And also, personally, I kind of want to eat out maybe 2 or 3 days a week.
So you want to go from here to there?
Yeah.
Okay, Katie.
Yeah, I really, really want to eat outside more, because when it's sunny, we're like, I want to eat outside, but we already did it once already.
So you're up for as many days as you can get.
Yes.
Okay, you want to eat out any day it's sunny? Okay. All right. What I want to say, kind of what Katie was saying, is that even though you've been allowed, Katie, thank you for looking at me when I'm talking to you, that you would really like to all the time have been eating 5 times a week outside and only once, but you're living with that even though it's not your first choice. So you're making a compromise.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it?
Part of what my goals for this year was to incorporate classroom meeting.
Okay, so what I hope you got from this, there's a number of things you could get from that, but one is, in terms of this idea of schools that children deserve, I'm really passionate about the idea that children own the agenda and they bring their own problems. Every so often I bring a problem, and it's really important to me that we have a lot of problems. So if you go down this path, I really encourage you, you need to go mining for problems. And the agenda that you saw that was half full now it's like full to bursting every week. They have so many problems to solve. And when there aren't enough, you have to create some, because the process is what's important. It's really all about their conversation with each other, their learning to listen to each other. Some of the language you heard them use, we teach them over time, so they know how to agree and disagree with each other and to express support even though they might, whatever. And eventually, this was the beginning of the year, they learn to lead their own meetings. And I just sit and don't do much, so I have kind of a scaffolded way to teach them how to lead. And I've had parents say, can you come and get your kids to teach the people where I work, how to lead? And more importantly, how to participate with responsibility in the meeting. So I think my 10 minutes is up, but I want to say just the last thing that is, and I think it's going to lead into what David and Annie are going to do, that the single, I think, most important thing I've learned in teaching is to come from a place of authenticity and integrity for myself, and to teach from a place of who I am, kind of your self piece, and that the single most important thing with a child is relationship. It's like the 3 R's in real estate: location, location, location. There's nothing more important in teaching than relationship, relationship, relationship. And it's that relationship that helps kids understand that they're safe and that they're cared about. And if you don't have that, you have nothing. So with that, I'll turn it over to the relationship. Thank you.
So our contribution to this journal issue was to come at it from the perspective of the teachers our children deserve. And in our article, we make an argument for the kinds of dispositions that need to be, the teachers need to prepare for teaching at what we think of as everybody's children. The full range of, linguistic, socioeconomic, ethnic, diversity, and so forth, of all dimensions. And in our presentation, and in the article, we feature examples of Annie's teaching to illustrate some of those issues. But I was particularly interested in seeking her out as a co-author, having worked with her as a student in this program. I'll explain more about that in a minute. But because I know that Annie became a teacher partly because she experienced persistent racism and discrimination as a student. She was an immigrant to this country, an English language learner as an elementary student, and she came to teaching to change the way she was treated. And that's been a significant issue. And we don't have enough people who are teachers who come to it from that background. In Washington State, we have, I think it's the second worst matchup between the demographics of the teachers and the demographics of the students in the whole country. And it's not just about demographics, but that's an important issue. So what we're trying to do in our article is to make a combination between an argument on behalf of broadening the demographics, but thinking about what kinds of dispositions does the teacher need, regardless of what demographic they fit into. I'm going to go first and just sort of lay out a little bit of our thinking about this idea of dispositions and how they're developed and what the framework is about. And then Annie's going to talk some about her experience in living that world. So I'm going to go back in time to about 2005 when I first met Annie as a student in this program. At that point, I was teaching in what was at that time LED 325, which was the introductory course in the elementary program. It's a little bit like what LED 370 is now. And students were in practicums one whole day a week, and they were doing journals to me to talk about their experiences. And I happened to have 3 students all placed in kindergartens, different kindergartens. And I noticed in the journals there were these really fascinating patterns. And student number 1 started to write about how she recognized that there were real problems in this classroom that she was placed in. She didn't feel the children were being treated well. They were interacting poorly with each other, and she didn't feel the teacher was really responding to that. But at the same time in her journal, she kept saying, but, you know, it's this teacher's classroom and there's not much I can do about it. And, you know, I don't agree with this, but, you know, what could I say? It was that sort of litany. Student number 2 was placed in another kindergarten, and she began to write about the fact that this cluster of English language learner students in this kindergarten were repeatedly sequestered back in one corner of the classroom behind a bunch of dividers. And they rarely got a chance to interact normally with the rest of the class. She rarely saw them participating in the class beyond just being there. So she set herself the task of making a connection with these students. And I get choked up just talking about this. I think a particular boy entered that class in February who had very little English language, came from Mexico. And she set us sort of a challenge for herself. I'm going to make a connection with this boy. And she got him to teach her words in Spanish. She was getting ready to teach a lesson for my class. And she determined, I'm going to create this lesson in such a way that this boy can participate. And she did that. And this was a person who had had no prior experience in that sort of a diverse setting. But she pulled that off. And then student number 3 was in yet another kindergarten. This is a place where a teacher had been teaching for 37 years. I think she was going to retire later that spring. And student number 3 is reporting to me in her journal after about 4 or 5 weeks. You know, the children in this classroom are not very respectful of each other. They don't interact in a way that's, you know, careful of each other. There's all kinds of squabbles and fights. And on a certain day at about the 5th week, she reported sitting down with a teacher while the children are out at recess, saying, can we do something about this? And this experienced teacher said, well, what would you do? So when the kids came back, this practicum student was allowed to try something. So she sat the kids down and she had a conversation with them about respect. And then they started talking about what would respect look like when we're lining up to go to recess? What would respect look like when we're in the lunchroom, you know, et cetera. And over a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, she started to make a tangible difference in that classroom just by teaching kids what it was. So I was really struck by this coincidence of these 3 examples, and it turns out student number 3 was this person. Sorry, I didn't think this would hit me this way. Yeah. But I think it sort of spurred me to understand what is the mechanism that leads to a person like this. Or mechanism is too mechanical a term, but so I started looking into that, reading some scholarly work and collecting. I created this research project that involved 20 students from our program in different settings, and I think I have a handle, at least that convinces me on at least one way to explain this. I think teachers bring inner qualities to an educational setting that are based on who they are, in Annie's case, based on important factors of discrimination and racism, as well as values like respect and ideas about how to teach, the vision of what teaching might look like, but a variety of kinds of inner qualities to the educational setting. And as you become a teacher, you learn a repertoire of practice, how to act, how to pull it off. In Annie's case, she had a beginning repertoire of how to get a class to sit down and talk about respect. At the same time, interacting with that, I think, is a growing sense of identity as a person who can do that kind of stuff. So that Annie had a particularly precocious connection between this initial repertoire of just the first things to do when my sense of respect or disrespect is triggered. I have an idea of how to deal with that. And she also had an image of herself as being capable of doing that. I could sit down with these kids and have this conversation rather than, oh, it's not my classroom, I can't do that. I can't imagine myself pulling that off. I better not do it. So I think there's an interesting interplay between this repertoire of practice and identity of practice. And I think you can recognize that similarly when you think about teaching a young child to read, for example. A good teacher will help a beginning reader recognize that they are, for example, becoming successful figuring out a word by sounding out the initial consonant, or that sort of strategy. And if that good teacher says back to the student, wow, look at what you just did. You figured out that word by sounding out the beginning sounds. You're really becoming a reader. So that child is developing a repertoire of practice as a reader, and you as a teacher are helping them develop an identity as a reader. That child develops a sense of what we sometimes call agency. The next book they face, they come to it a little more easily because they have that confidence that I know where to begin. I know how to get somewhere. So that might not be the only way to describe, to understand this concept, but I think that's a powerful example of at least one promising way to understand how this mysterious idea about dispositions for the kind of teaching that we're talking about formed. What I tried to do was then think about, okay, well, what are some of the important dimensions of it and how do you foster it? And I borrowed an idea from people that talk about teaching for understanding called performances of understanding. Performances of understanding are learning activities that one can engage in, and the way you engage in them reflects your emerging understanding. So if you're, let's see, if you're learning to play on a basketball team, and the coach gives you a drill, and you're able to, do some sort of teamwork move where you position yourself in an appropriate position. The way you do that reflects back to the coach. You're developing understanding of that strategy. So you're learning to do it while at the same time you're reflecting back your learning. And so I think that there are a lot of dimensions of these dispositional indicators that might be important, but for the sake of this article, with help from some of my colleagues, Kristen is one of them in our work in the college, we've begun to target a set of dispositional indicators that we think are particularly important for this issue of doing well by everybody's children. And the ones that we focused on in the article, I'll close with this and turn it over to Annie to talk a little bit, but teachers need to reliably engage with others with an ethic of care, sensitivity, and responsiveness. And I think this has been echoed all the way down the panel. Just a different way of saying that same notion of inclusivity, that you go out of your way to build that connection and relationship. Teachers need to recognize that everyone grows up with a worldview that is influenced differently by factors such as culture, gender, race, ethnicity, and social background. We are not neutral. We come to it with perspective, and that we need to take responsibility for that and try to learn as much as we can about the lenses we are looking through. Teachers need to have a commitment toward achieving a society that embraces diversity and promotes social justice. I think that's also echoed in Paul's notion of inclusivity, a vision of what the world needs to be like that includes everybody. Teachers need to question their own perspectives and reflect with integrity and insight on their decisions and actions. That's been around for a long time, but it's still every bit as true. And finally, teachers need to be curious and persistent in pursuing academic and professional knowledge while acquiring and enacting a repertoire of practices with increasing intentionality and flexibility. I just want to expand on that briefly. What I was saying earlier about this interplay between a repertoire of practice and an identity of practice develops towards this notion of increasing intentionality and flexibility. As you gain expertise, you have a wider array of strategies for promoting respect. You can implement them with greater deliberateness and flexibility depending on the setting. That's what marks a more experienced teacher from a beginner. So that kind of trajectory can be fostered by providing students with performances of understanding that scaffold that development. So I want to turn it to Annie to sort of share some experience from her journey as a teacher.
Hi. I'm looking around. Some of you look a little glazed. We should do some like brain exercises.
Exactly, it's time for a
Yeah,
wiggle break.
let's do some cross-lateral movement. I have to tell you, first of all. Oh, okay. Stretch. Touch your left or right side to the other side. Do it on both sides. You're welcome. I have to preface also, I'm in my first trimester of pregnancy, so I'm like woozy. Like watching your video, I had to kind of turn away because I was getting a little bit dizzy. So bear with me in case I throw up or pass out or anything.
I'm here to catch you.
Okay, good. So I've been teaching at a high poverty school for the last 4 years in Seattle Public School District. High ELL population, and when I talk about high poverty, we're talking really close to 90% brain reduced lunch. So with that comes a lot of challenges and baggage with the kids. They have emotional baggage. They don't know how to navigate conflict. They don't have a set of emotional ranges, you know, like empathy beyond that. It's really just the basic things like fear and anger and happiness, and, you know, getting them to see beyond that gets difficult at times, and how to deal with problems. We also have 2 EBD classrooms in our school, which is emotional behavior disorder classrooms. So these are kids that range with extreme behaviors, throwing desks, having verbal outbursts, you know, swearing, throwing fits, screaming in the hallway, things like that. So, and they're in the special education program. So really, it's a pretty challenging school, and it takes a lot of energy to teach there, and it's nice to hear about class meetings. We also do class meetings, and it looks a little bit different, and our problems are like, you know, hitting, like those kind of things. So I wanted to ask how many of you have actually read the article? I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot. I'm totally putting you on the spot, I'm sorry. So just if you did want to read more about it, and are most of you prospective teachers? Okay, so, you know, it's a little weird to like advertise it to you, but those experiences that I share are my genuine thinking processes. So sometimes if you are confused or struggling, I think that would be, you know, hopefully really helpful to you to see how I kind of thought through things and some of the experiences I had, and it was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? You know, this kid's going crazy. What am I supposed to do? How do I handle that? And a lot of the paper in my writing is those experiences. I'm going to share a story about Jack, who was really, really difficult as a student. And this was illustrating disposition number 1, which is great that I picked this, because it's like hitting the theme I didn't even know it was going to hit. Teachers need to reliably engage with others with an ethic of care, sensitivity, and responsiveness. So Jack, just a background on him, some of the issues he was having in class: difficulty listening and following directions. That's a really common problem, you know, how do you get kids engaged and care about what's going on. He talked back, he whispered rude stuff, you know, you walk away and he's kind of griping at you. He had a lot of attitude. He would ignore you, so you'd say, Jack, Jack, and it's kind of like he didn't even exist, you know, he's just blocking you out. He gave up really easily, he shut down, he was disengaged in lessons and activities a lot of the time. So as you're teaching, it's, you know, it's really hard to stop and address those issues, but you do have to address them, because when you ignore them, they just build up, and then you really have lost that student. So what I felt at the time, and this was my 2nd year of teaching, I was nervous. I felt scared to talk to him. You know, he had been bothering me, and I had been feeling really upset about it. So I was scared that if I talked to him, I was just gonna explode. You know, why are you doing this? What's your problem? Why are you giving me attitude? That kind of thing. And this was a 3rd grader.
Yeah.
3rd grader. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Were you curious? This wasn't a preschool or kindergarten or anything. 3rd grader. So at that point, I had to think, well, what can I do to just connect with this student? What do I need to do to address this? So I just held him in at recess, and we had a conversation. And it wasn't to be put your head down, you owe me 10 minutes for being rude, you know, that kind of thing. It was really to get to know the motivation behind his actions. So I held him in a recess, I started asking questions. I would say things like, I noticed that when I tried to help you in math today, you just kind of ignored me, you know, and I'm wondering what's going on with you. Why did you do that? Did something happen today? What's going on with you? And just trying to get to know him. It took, I don't know, probably 8 times holding him at a recess and asking him those questions until he finally started to open up a little bit and trust me and see that I wasn't there to just hold him in a recess for behaviors. I was there to get to know him and really like understand where he's coming from. Eventually he did open up and he was more cooperative and we just had really built that relationship together. And that's one of the things, again, just it's so important to go back to the relationship piece. And when kids see that you genuinely care and you're going to take the time to get to know them, it makes just a day and night difference. I mean, it's amazing the effect of that. I forgot to mention that. So what I did learn about Jack was that the reason he was doing those things is because he had low self-efficacy, low self-esteem. When I tried to get information about him from his other teachers, I think they had unintentionally embarrassed him. You know, like he didn't know the answer. Like, come on, you didn't know that? That, you know, that kind of thing where they didn't mean to embarrass him, but for someone who's very sensitive, it did embarrass him. So I realized he was just a really sensitive kid, and I had to do, from that knowledge, a lot of intentional things like, you know, encouraging him, like, yesterday you could do this math, so today I know you're going to really, really be great at it. You know, you were able to show me you can do it, I know you're going to do today. I'd prep ahead of time so he would feel successful, so I'd have him partner up with someone before he presented to the class, or, you know, just kind of scaffolded his self-esteem and built him up. And then, yeah, it helped him too, I think, meeting with him, for him to take ownership of his own actions and how he could change things also. And then we had an avenue now to work things out. If he was giving me attitude again one day, I just quick 2-minute meeting at recess, what's up with you? I didn't get enough sleep last night, or, you know, whatever, what the case may be, and then it's squashed. And he comes back from recess, new guy, you know, totally fixed, for the most part. So, one thing that I had wanted to tell you, and Dave and I had talked about this in his office, is just the idea that right now in education, tough schools, like the schools that I'm at, are the ones that no one really wants to be at, because it comes with a lot of challenges. And it's also high attrition rate. I mean, first year teachers come there and drop like flies. Like they're just 1 year of it and it's too much and they're moving on. And so those are the kids that need the consistency and they don't have it, because every year people are leaving. So I really encourage you, if you're in a struggling situation like that and you're out there trying to teach, to just stick with it. It's so hard. I'm just gonna put that out there. It's really hard, but it's really rewarding, because the kids, at the end of the day, are kids. They're sweet, and you get to know them, and they become these people to you. You know, and it's really, really
What did you feel like after your first year?
Oh. Do you want the truth or the candy-coated?
It didn't happen in 1 year for you, but it happened phenomenally in 2 or 3.
Over time. And even prior to teaching full-time, I was a substitute teacher. And as a new sub, guess what jobs you get? The ones that no one wants, that, you know, are the really hard schools. So that was a learning curve. And then prior to that, I had taught a summer school program that was really hard. Lots of difficult children. This was like a free program on Rainier Ave, and so for a lot of parents, it was like, oh, babysitter in the summertime, great, I don't really care about education, but here's my kids being watched for me. And they were crazy. I mean, I had to break up fights all the time. Kids would swear in my face, they'd call me the B word, they'd tell me to shut the F up, you know, stuff like that. So after that experience, I kind of wanted to steer clear, and then I subbed. And then after my first year of full-time teaching, I really wanted to give up. And it was kind of the same feeling like, can I even do this? This is really hard. Like, I'm just taking abuse every single day, and why am I doing this? And I just stuck with it. And then, you know, you still have your moments where you're like, should I really be doing this? Could I get like a desk job, you know, and just take an easy day and check my email during the day, go to the bathroom when I want to, and all that stuff. But it's just so rewarding at the end of it, especially if you stick with it. And you will build the tools that you need, especially in difficult schools. You'll get there.
I gotta know, why did you stick with it?
I'm crazy. I don't know. I feel like maybe I'm crazy. I think, no, honestly, I think it's the reward of it.
Did you just know, had you experienced that reward, or did you just know that there's got to be a reward at the end of all of it?
You experience it all the time. So for as many downs that you have as many ups, and it's kind of like, what did you describe it as, crack earlier? Who was I talking to? That wasn't you? Okay, sorry. So someone I was talking to earlier.
I'm intrigued by this.
It's like this high, you know, like, oh, you're having the worst day. You just go home and cry. And I cried a lot during my first year of teaching. And you just want to give up, and then something happens and you're like, yes, I got them. You know, they're doing it. I'm going to take a moment and look, and oh my gosh, they're actually succeeding, and they're doing the expectations. What happened? And it is like crack. Like, you just feed on that, and you love that, and it's the absolute lows get just as high. So it's really just a balance, and the days that you quit, you just grasp on those really great days to push you forward.
There's kind of a sense of intimacy, really, and you know, the hardest kids really you develop the deepest relationships with, and it's almost like a little endorphin rush when you really get that moment of...
It's the crack.
It's the crack. I remember early on realizing that working with a child about writing and reading and writing, second graders, was like somebody cut a hole in their brains, and I got a window into their souls that I think even their parents don't see. And it's not a sense of power, but it's a sense of vulnerability and intimacy with children. That, yeah, it's better than sex. I mean, it's better than your marriage. It's closer than you're going to get with anybody. When you have a child in your life that's willing to lay their soul bare to you.
Yeah.
I mean, I have the one you just described. I have one like that in my life today. A little boy who shuts down and breaks my heart. And
this is for people who are emotionally developed enough to notice those feelings. Not everybody would care or notice. I mean, you have to be developed enough in your emotions to resonate with a feeling like that. That deep personal satisfaction from having helped another person. Not everybody gets that.
And willing to be vulnerable myself. Like, how many times have you cried in front of your class?
Oh my gosh.
And the kids
You
stare
cry
at you.
in front of your class too?
They watch their eyes like they've never seen us kiss, and they look at you like, wow, my teacher's really crying. And they're
I'm
just
a human
stunned.
being. I
They're
have
stunned
feelings.
by
I
it.
have
Yeah.
emotions.
Sorry, Dean Rios, go for it.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you.
We're addicted.
It's pretty engaging. I mean, I want to keep going on the crack thing here. But you know, the one thing that you notice about those students is that they seem to have the best attendance. Anyway, I want to just let you know a little bit about how I kind of see the world, because that might explain how I'm going to be coming at, or how I came at this particular piece. I had the opportunity, wonderful opportunity, to go with about 20 Navajo kids and teachers and spiritual leaders, and about 20 teacher education students and faculty from university I was teaching at in California, rafting down the Grand Canyon for 4 days, and it was absolutely marvelous. It was one of those moments on the bucket list. If you ever get a chance, you want to be able to do that, and it was great because we were learning about geographical formations, and we were learning about ecology, and we were learning about each other, and we were learning about ourselves, no question. There was this moment that a colleague of mine and I were walking, just taking a little hike, and there was this really striking moment when we were both kind of in this very little narrow gorge, and all of a sudden I was like looking up going, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. And I looked over and she's like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. So here I was looking at this really broad, big picture, and she was looking at this little trilobite, or I'm not really sure, a little seashell or something. She was really focused on the narrow, and I was really focused on the broad. And so the article that I wrote really is writing about looking at this broad picture, because I tend to look at things from this really broad lens. And it happens every day for me that I kind of tend to look at things from this broad lens. And I just want to share with you that when you do that, you often come in contact with lots of tension. You start noticing a lot of tension, a lot of contradictions, and asking yourself about these in-between places where you find yourself between these tensions and these competing forces and these competing ideologies. And I'll just share two with you because they happen, one on Monday and one on Tuesday. And it's just, again, the way that I'm kind of looking at the world. And I was with 495 of my closest friends at the Seattle Business Forum in Seattle, where Western was putting on a really nice kind of celebration and fundraising event for people in the Seattle community. I'm struggling with the commercialization of public education. And so anytime I'm in a place where there's business, there's automatically kind of a little tension for me. But I'm sitting next to people who are some of the best donors of our college, who've never come to our university, and they weren't students of our college or our university. They're deeply engaged in and care about education. And they care about you, and they want to and have provided funding for you. And so I was thinking about this tension between my angst about commercialization and yet sitting next to these business people who are great philanthropists and great supporters of our college and of our students. And then the next day, and this was really out there, yesterday, as you might recall, the great picture that you have, Paul, that's right there. It was a day where people in the movement were asking people to boycott restaurants and stores and businesses. And yet in Bellingham, the restaurants were giving 20% of their profit, if you went to restaurants, to the local food bank, right? So talk about, do I go? Do I not go? Where am I at here? And I'm in these in-between places, right? So I find myself in these in-between places. And so my work really starts at talking about the difficulty of being in these contradictory or kind of what I'm calling now in-between places, but they're really places of tension. And I think about just 4 examples of these kind of in-between places of these tensions. And one is for us personally in the fact that especially those of us who learn to develop kind of a critical consciousness and are often critical of education institutions, but also recognizing that that's what we're preparing to go work in, or we are currently working in, and this tension of both being a critic of the very places for a lot of different reasons that we're in fact training and learning to be part of, and how do we manage that tension, and what are the in-between places in there. And then I'm thinking about the pedagogical tension between kind of the push for these authoritative technological approaches to teaching, scripted curriculums, standardized assessments, with all the humane, nurturing pedagogy that you heard talked about here. And how do we find ourselves in those in-between places of maybe being forced to use these technological or technical approaches to education, while at the same time knowing that the nurturing, humane pedagogy are really the things that are going to make a difference in kids' lives. I think about it in terms of at the professional level, there's this incessant attack on teachers and making their jobs more difficult by increasing class sizes and periodically sending RIF notices out and essentially taking away their creativity on the one hand, and then a common narrative that's also saying, but teachers are the most important thing that matter in a kid's life. And you're like, really? If you believe that, then why are you doing this? Right? There's a tension, and there's like, how do we find those in-between places within that tension? And finally, in terms of preparation for becoming teachers, and you get these deregulated, fast-track, shorter, faster, easier approaches to teacher ed. Teach for America, or what Ken Zeitner called teach for a while, right? Approaches versus the kind of approaches that we're taking where we think you have to have a broad repertoire of knowledge, both liberal arts as well as in teacher ed. You need to have a deep understanding of content knowledge. You need to begin developing a nice repertoire of beginning of pedagogical approaches, and that's very heavily regulated. It's very there's a lot of standardization. Those of you who are in the program know there's lots of assessments that you got to pass. They don't trust our opinion and say you'd be a great teacher. You have to pass all these assessments and so forth. And so again, we're at this kind of in-between places. We're allowing kind of a deregulation and other people to come in and run it as fast and as quick and as cheap as possible. Yet they're creating more and more barriers for traditional teacher education programs. And I think really what I hope that you take away is really that all of us have to grapple with the ways that we have to negotiate these tensions and the ways that you're able to find these in-between places for yourself that make it easy to at least go to sleep at night and not toss and turn and wonder if you're going crazy. So the paper more specifically focuses on, starts with talking about the broad purposes of education, and generally people talk about 4 broad purposes. Preparation for an occupation, mostly around, that's really the emphasis on math, science, reading, and writing. The second is self-development and the importance of developing critical thinking skills, ethical decision-making abilities, important sense of who you are and who you are in relationship to the rest of the world. The third is social development, recognizing yourself in relationship to other people, families, communities, peers, elders, and how you begin to negotiate those social development pieces. And then finally, the fourth purpose that people will describe are democratic engagement and civic responsibility. And I tend to think about kind of two. There's kind of a surface level dimension to that, which is about voting and making sure that you champion people's freedom of speech and working in some service learning capacity, or maybe working at the local food bank. And then what I would call critical civic engagement, where you're not just doing all that, but you're asking, but why is it that there's poverty in the first place? Why is it that that there's marginalization in our communities in the first place? And that kind of critical dimension. And of course, when you think about all 4 of those purposes, educators would say if we knew there was just one of those, we could go at it with laser guidance and we could really do well on it. But it also, like for all of us, we know that we want all 4 of them. All 4 of them are important, and all 4 of them are critical. So how do we, and even sometimes when they're in contradiction. So then I change and talk a little bit about the education as a profession. And again, focusing on the fact that we indeed need strong education professionals who are good teachers, who know what constitutes meaningful and engaging curriculum, powerful curriculum, know how to do assessments, know and engage in the kind of continual improvement that you were mentioning is one of the dispositions that would be important, and how to do that with a variety of kids from a variety of different backgrounds. But also, and we can't stop there. We need people as education professionals who are also thinking about schools from what I would call an ecological lens. That is, that that's just part of what you're doing in a classroom. You also are part of a grade community. Maybe all the 4th grade teachers get together, or all the science teachers get together. And so you have to be caring about them, because you have to be caring about all the students in the school. And then you have to think about, we need a whole healthy school. So now I'm a member of a school community. Now I'm also recognize that kids are coming from families, so I have to be concerned about their families. And because they also spend lots of their time in the community, I have to be worried about healthy communities. And so we start thinking about people as not just being prepared to, have a really engaging lesson plan or really have a really respectful classroom management system, but really also to be stewards and caretakers of these broader systems that education is taking place in. And then turn to all of this, ask the questions, what does it mean to be a citizen? Remember I'm like the Grand Canyon, oh my gosh, wow, now it's asking me about what does it mean to be a citizen? And I start grappling a little bit with that question and, and really thinking about, how we think about ourselves in terms of citizenship. That this isn't just work associated with being a good teacher, it's also work associated with being a good citizen. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a good citizen? And so I rely on Cornel West's notion of 3 elements of, Walter Parker's notion of 3 elements of good citizenship, and he talks about participatory democracy, not just voting rights and, food bank kinds of stuff, but working with people to understand the issue as they understand it, the challenges in their life as they understand it, and working with them to solve the problems in the way that they best understand it. And that the greatest threat to our democracy is these social inequalities. And then he talks about creative democracy, helping people realize that the democracy is not there yet. We've had some great advances in terms of the end of the Civil War, the great advances in terms of amendments that have passed, giving women the right to vote. The 50s and 60s, great advancements in terms of really getting to that democratic ideal. But really helping kids and helping people understand we're still not there yet. And there's still a role that people have to play to move us to that democratic ideal. And then finally he calls the multicultural democracy, which asks of the first one, who's participating and who's not, and on what terms. And it asks of the creative democracy, how can we create the widest possible path? And then I end up, well, I didn't end the paper, actually, there's 2 other pieces. One, I look at 5 key issues that we're facing in colleges of education. One is how do we respond to neoliberalism, continual neoliberalism. How many of you, anybody can say neoliberalism? Anybody know what that is? Somebody knows here, really. Kristen with neoliberalism. It's I like Carol Edelsky's notion. It's capitalism with the gloves off. It's full blown, in your face, believing that capitalism can solve all of the nation's problem, and we need unfettered, unregulated business, which we all know what happened as a result of that, right? Look at the banking industry. But that's the idea, and that essentially, if we just ran schools like essentially businesses, then everything would be. They know how to resolve all the pressing problems in schools. How do we balance that out with the recognition that most of us probably share of education, not as a private good to be bought and sold, but as a public good for broad public purposes. I talked about the deregulation of teacher education as a second issue. The continual bashing of teachers is a third issue. How do we respond to that continual bashing of teachers? How do we respond to these broad social inequalities that indeed are persistent and that we need to be able to resolve? And how do we address those, especially when it comes to issues of access and achievement for the most marginalized of our communities? And I ended that section with one question, which was, and one that I still am anxious to hear, which is how is the Obama administration, what's going to be their role, and how are they going to understand public education? Are they going to really take a progressive approach to thinking about public education and whenever and whatever the new ESEA Act will be, or will they continue that neoliberalist trend? I end by talking about what's going to sustain our work, and several of you asked questions about what sustained Annie in terms of her work, and there's a great book by Kristen's mentor by Sonia Nieto called What Keeps Teachers Going. Is that right? What Keeps Teachers Going? If you want, it's a great book. I bet it's somewhere in here. Remember, I'm looking out. I'm like, What Keeps Teachers Going? It's a great story about what does keep teachers going, and those of you who are interested in that question, I strongly encourage you to look at it. And I suggest several things. One, I think, and it goes back to what Whatcom Day Academy does, a strong mission and core values.